What if the person you loved most in the world vanished into thin air, not in the chaos of war, but on the very day he was supposed to come home? For 40 years, it was a cold case, a mystery without a single clue. But now, a discovery has been made, a file that was never supposed to be found. It reveals a hidden journey, a secret facility, and one final, devastating message from beyond the grave. This is the truth that was never meant to be told. The answer to a 40-year mystery is waiting for you in the final chapter. If you want to be the first to know what really happened to the soldier who never came home, make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications on. You will not want to miss this. The world was a flickering photograph, a place of shifting shadows and stark contrasts, captured forever in the silent, grainy monochrome of 1946. The great and terrible war was over, but its echo remained, a constant, low hum in the background of everyday life. In a small town nestled amongst rolling hills, where the maple trees had just begun their fiery transformation from green to a brilliant, burning orange, life was cautiously learning how to be peaceful again. The central nervous system of this town, on a crisp October afternoon, was the railway station. It was a place of raw, unfiltered emotion. The platform was packed. A sea of hopeful faces turned towards the empty tracks that stretched into the distant, hazy horizon. Women in practical dresses, their hair carefully styled for the occasion, held the hands of fidgeting children who barely remembered the fathers they were about to meet. Older men, their own wars long past, stood with a quiet dignity, their eyes reflecting a shared understanding of what these returning boys had endured. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a collective held breath, thick with the scent of steam and cold dust and the faint, sweet perfume of excitement. Then a sound, a low, mournful whistle that grew into a earth-shaking rumble. The train, a great black iron beast, emerged from the distance. It stacked belching plumes of white smoke against the gray sky. It hissed and groaned to a halt, the metallic shriek of brakes a symphony of finality. The doors clattered open, and then the flood. Young men in worn and faded uniforms spilled onto the platform, their duffel bags slung over shoulders, their faces a complex map of relief, exhaustion, and a day's joy. The station erupted. The silence shattered into 1,000 pieces of laughter, sobs, shouted names, and the sweet, crushing sound of embraces reunited. A small boy was hoisted onto his father's shoulders. An elderly mother cupped her son's face, her tears leaving dark spots on his olive-drab jacket. It was a picture of an ending, a happy closure to a painful chapter. But on the edge of this joyful chaos, one small group stood perfectly still, an island of anxious stillness in the turbulent sea of reunion. There was Mr. Miller, a tall, stern man whose usual composure was cracked by the nervous way he clenched and unclenched his hands. Beside him, his wife, Helen, stood on her toes, her eyes desperately scanning the crowd, her fingers nervously twisting a lace handkerchief into a tight knot. And with them was Eleanor, young, heartbreakingly beautiful, with eyes the color of summer sky and a hope so bright it could have lit the entire town. She held not a handkerchief, but a photograph, the edges softened from constant handling. It showed a young man with an easy, lopsided grin, his army cap tilted back on his head. Private James Miller. Her James, the love of her very short life. He had written to her every week, his letters filled with dreams of their future together, a small house, a family, a peace he was fighting to secure. This day was the first page of that future. As the crowd on the platform began to thin, as the last joyful cries faded and families began their happy journeys home, the stillness around the Miller family grew heavier, more profound. The station master, a kind-faced man named Walter, approached them slowly, his cap in his hands. His expression was a verdict before he even spoke. "I'm real sorry, folks," he said, his voice soft with a pity that felt like a physical blow. That was the last one today from the East. His name wasn't on the manifest. The hope did not leave their faces all at once. It was a slow, cruel draining. first from Helen's eyes, then from Mr. Miller's stiff posture. Eleanor's grip on the photograph tightened until her knuckles were white. "There must be a mistake," she whispered, the words sounding frail and thin in the vast, empty space. "He said he'd be on this train. He promised." They stayed until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in colors the black and white world could not show, casting long, lonely shadows across the deserted platform. They walked home in a silence that was louder than any noise, each step a mile longer than the last. The days that followed were a torturous cycle of phone calls to vague military offices and letters written in neat, polite script that begged for answers. The official response was always the same, a maddening loop of bureaucratic confusion. James Miller had been processed out of his unit. His paperwork was in order. He had received his discharge papers and his pay. He was seen, healthy and whole, preparing to board the transport home. And then nothing. It was as if he had simply stepped off the face of the earth. The local newspaper ran a small piece, a few column inches next to an advertisement for a new grocery store. "Local boy missing," the headline read, though the text was careful, full of words like delay and miscommunication, offering a fragile hope that the community clung to. For months, then a year, the Miller house existed in a state of suspended animation. Helen continued to set a place for him at the dinner table, the click of the unused cutlery the loudest sound in the room. Mr. Miller took to walking to the station every afternoon, just to stand and watch the trains come in, as if his will alone could correct this monumental error. And Eleanor waited. She waited through the turning of the seasons, through the vibrant, busy 50s and the turbulent 60s, her life narrowing to the four walls of the town library where she worked and the quiet, persistent ache of a question that would never be answered. The mystery of what happened to James Miller became a part of the town's fabric, a sad story told on porch swings on summer nights, a ghost story without a ghost, a puzzle with the most important piece forever lost. The world, oblivious, marched forward in brilliant, noisy color, leaving the Millers behind in their silent, grave vigil, waiting for a train that would never, ever arrive. The decades that followed were not kind to the mystery of James Miller. They were a slow, steady burial under the layers of new life and new worries. The 1950s bled into the 1960s, a period of immense change that seemed to make the unresolved pain of the war feel like a relic from another, more distant age. The Miller house, once a place of such vibrant hope, became a monument to a frozen moment in time. His parents, Harold and Helen, aged not just with years, but with the heavy weight of the unknown. They rarely spoke of him after the first few years, not because they forgot, but because the words themselves were too sharp, too painful to form. The single, untouched setting at the dinner table was finally cleared away, not in a moment of acceptance, but after Helen, her hands trembling, dropped a china plate one evening. The sound of its shattering was so final, so destructive, that it seemed to break the spell of waiting. They could not live with the daily reminder of an absence that screamed so loudly. Eleanor, whose entire youth had been defined by that wait at the train station, slowly built a life around the hollow space James had left behind. She became the head librarian, a respected and kindly figure in the town. She found solace in the quiet order of books, in stories that had beginnings, middles, and, most importantly, endings. Young men came and went, some showing interest in the pretty, quiet woman with the sad eyes, but she gently turned them all away. How could she explain that her heart was not hers to give? It was still held in trust, a promise made to a ghost. She visited Harold and Helen every Sunday without fail, a ritual that was both a comfort and a penance. They would sit in the parlor, the air thick with things unsaid, speaking of the weather, of town gossip, of anything but the handsome young man in the silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece, whose smile seemed to grow more enigmatic with each passing year. Harold passed away first in the late 70s, followed soon after by Helen. It was said in town that she died of a broken heart, though the doctor called it pneumonia. With them gone, Eleanor felt the last tangible link to James sever. The house was sold, his belongings carefully packed into boxes that she stored in her own small attic. The world had well and truly moved on. The story of the missing soldier was now just that, a story, a piece of local folklore, occasionally mentioned to newcomers with a sad shake of the head. Did you hear about the Miller boy? Went off to war, came back fine, they say, then just vanished in a thin air, right off the train platform. The details had blurred and twisted over time, becoming less a real tragedy that happened to real people and more a curious, slightly spooky tale. For Eleanor, the approach of the 40th anniversary of that day in October was not marked on any calendar, but her body felt it. A deepening of the autumn chill, a certain quality to the light that felt unervingly familiar. She found herself more withdrawn, spending longer hours at the library, organizing and reorganizing the archives, perhaps subconsciously seeking order in a world that had once been so cruelly disordered. It was on one such afternoon, a Tuesday, the sky outside the tall library windows the same flat, featureless gray it had been 4 decades prior, that the phone on her desk rang. The sound was jarring in the profound quiet of the reference section. The voice on the other end was young, female, and brisk with official efficiency. Am I speaking to an Eleanor Vance? The use of her maiden name, a name she had not legally held for 45 years, since the day she had planned to marry James Miller, sent a jolt through her. Yes, she said, her voice faint. This is she. The woman identified herself as a records clerk from the National Personnel Records Center. She explained in a calm, practiced tone that there was a routine, decades-long project underway to digitize and recatalog military service record from the Second World War. During this process, she said, certain files that had been misfiled or cross-referenced with incorrect identifiers were being discovered and corrected. Eleanor listened, her grip tightening on the receiver, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She could not imagine why this concerned her. Ma'am, the clerk continued, her tone shifting slightly, becoming less robotic and more curious. We've encountered a file pertaining to a Private James Alastair Miller. Our records indicate you were listed as his primary next of kin and intended spouse on several of his personnel forms. Eleanor could only manage a soft, affirmative sound. The world around her, the smell of old paper and dust, the distant sound of a computer printer, seemed to recede, becoming distant and muffled. Well, the clerk went on, a note of hesitation in her voice now. It appears his file was closed in error very shortly after his discharge. It was marked case, concluded, and filed not with the active missing persons inquiries, but within a separate administrative archive. It was essentially lost. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Lost. The word was so small, so utterly inadequate to describe the ocean of uncertainty it had created. What are you saying? She whispered. The clerk paused, and Eleanor could hear the rustle of paper, a keyboard clicking softly. I'm saying, Ms. Vance, that the digital cross-referencing has flagged his case due to an anomaly. A document that wasn't scanned into the main file until last week. It was found physically paper-clipped to the back of another serviceman's folder from the same unit. A carbon copy of a form we don't typically see attached to honorable discharge papers. The woman's voice dropped, as if she were sharing a secret. It's a request for expedited processing, not for a discharge, but for an immediate transfer. A reassignment, and it's dated October 3rd, 1946, the day he was supposed to come home. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. She leaned heavily against her desk, the polished wood cool against her palm. A transfer? It made no sense. He had written to her, his letters filled with such specific, eager plans for their life together. He had talked about the farm he wanted to buy, the porch swing he would build for her. There was not a single hint, not a whisper of a desire to stay in the service. Where? Eleanor asked, her voice a dry rasp. Where was he transferred to? The clerk's hesitation was longer this time, more pronounced. That's the other part of the anomaly, ma'am. The form lists the receiving unit only by numerical designation, not name. Unit 7, and the authorization signature. It's there, but it's faint, and the name is, well, It's not one that appears in any of our command databases for that theater or time period. It's like it was a ghost unit. It doesn't officially exist. The clerk took a breath. We are, of course, reopening the file. But given the highly unusual nature of this, and the time that has passed, I felt compelled to inform you personally. We will be sending a formal packet of these rediscovered documents to you for your records. Eleanor hung up the phone, the click echoing in the sudden, immense silence. She stood there for a long time, unmoving. The simple, tragic story of her life, the sweetheart who never came home from the war, was suddenly not simple at all. It had been rewritten in an instant, not with an answer, but with a deeper, more unsettling mystery. A transfer on the very day of his homecoming. A unit that didn't exist. A signature from a man who wasn't there. 40 years of grief, of quiet acceptance, began to crack and splinter, revealing not closure, but a terrifying and dark abyss of possibility. James hadn't just vanished. Something had happened to him. Something had taken him. And the first faint, chilling evidence of it was now, finally, coming to light. The formal packet from the National Personnel Records Center arrived a week later. A thick manila envelope that felt far too light to contain the weight of 40 years of unanswered questions. Eleanor carried it into her small, tidy living room, her hands trembling slightly. She placed it on the coffee table, as if it were a sleeping animal that might startle awake. For a long time, she simply sat in her armchair, a cup of tea going cold in her hands, and stared at it. This was it. After all the waiting, all the years of silence, here was a physical thing, a collection of papers that held a truth the world had forgotten. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, and the room was so quiet she could hear the steady, anxious thump of her own heart. Finally, with a resolve that felt fragile, she opened the envelope. The first few pages were standard, dry bureaucratic letters explaining the rediscovery of the file and apologizing for the administrative oversight. The language was cold, clinical, completely detached from the human tragedy it represented. Then, her fingers brushed against an older, more brittle piece of paper. It was the transfer order. The paper was yellowed with age, the typewritten letters faint and slightly blurred in places. October 3rd, 1946. The date screamed at her from the page. It detailed the immediate reassignment of Private James Alistair Miller, effective immediately, to a unit designated only as Unit 7. The reason for transfer was listed as specialized skills reassignment, but what those skills were was not specified. James had been a radio operator. It was a vital job, but not one she would have called uniquely specialized. And then there was the signature. It was a messy, hurried scrawl. The ink faded to a pale brown. The name beneath was barely legible, but she could make out the first initial, a looping J, and then what looked like Winters or maybe Walters. The clerk was right. It was a ghost. Beneath, that was a carbon copy of a transportation manifest. It listed soldiers being moved from a processing center in New York to various points across the country. James's name was there, but it had a neat line drawn through it, and beside it, in a different, finer pen, was written a single word, redirected. And below that, a train number and a destination that made her blood run cold. It wasn't a military base. It wasn't a debriefing center. The destination was a small, remote town in the northern reaches of Maine, a place called Millwood, a place she had never heard a mention, a place with no known military installation of any kind. Why would the Army send a soldier to a tiny, isolated town in Maine the day he was supposed to come home? Her mind raced, trying to fit these jagged, nonsensical pieces together. It made no sense. None of it. A secret unit. A mysterious J. Walters. A train to the middle of nowhere. This wasn't a simple case of a lost file or a paperwork error. This was a deliberate act. Someone had taken him. Someone had pulled him from the path of his life and sent him down a dark, hidden corridor. The grief she had carried for so long began to curdle into something else. A cold, sharp fear. What had he gotten involved in? Was it something dangerous? Something he couldn't tell her about? The last item in the packet was not an official document. It was a small, faded photograph, paper-clipped to the back of the manifest. It was a casual snapshot, the kind taken by a friend with a personal camera. It showed a group of 4 soldiers, arms slung around each other's shoulders, smiling wearily in front of a bombed-out building somewhere in Europe. James was in the middle, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. She knew this photo. He had sent a copy to her. But in her version, it was just the 4 men. In this version, someone had been cropped out. On the far right edge of the photograph, just barely in the frame, was the shoulder of a 5th man and a hand resting on James's arm. And on the wrist of that hand, just visible, was an unusual watch with a dark, square face and a bright silver buckle. It was a small, intimate detail, a fragment of a person who had been deliberately removed from the picture. Why? Who was he? Eleanor spent the next few days in a feverish haze. The peaceful rhythm of her life was completely shattered. The library where she had found such comfort now felt like a cage. Her mind was 1,000 miles away, in a musty archive and a lonely train station in 1946. She had to know more. She called the records clerk back, but the woman could offer nothing further. The trail, she said apologetically, had gone cold. The designation, Unit 7, appeared nowhere else. The name, J. Walters, yielded no results. It was a dead end, driven by a desperation she had not felt in decades. Eleanor did the only thing she could think to do. She called in a favor from an old friend, a history professor at the state university who had access to deeper archival systems than she could ever hope to navigate. She gave him the little information she had, the date, the possible name, the watch, the destination of Millwood, Maine. She felt foolish, like a character in a cheap spy novel. But the professor, sensing her deep distress, agreed to help. Days passed. Each one felt like a year. She jumped every time the phone rang, her stomach tightening into a hard knot of anticipation and dread. The call came on a rainy evening. The professor's voice was no longer curious, but cautious, almost nervous. "Eleanor," he began, "I found something. Not much, and it's strange." He told her that the name J. Walters appeared on no official military rolls for the European or domestic theaters. However, he did find a single, declassified memo from early 1947, authorizing a budget allocation for a small, interagency liaison and assessment group that had been quietly disbanded. The memo was signed by a deputy undersecretary named Jacob Walker. Walters. It was close. Could it be the same man? The group had no official number, but its stated, vague purpose was to integrate and utilize specialized wartime skill sets for emerging national security interests. The professor's voice dropped. "Eleanor, this doesn't smell right. This kind of language, this level of secrecy, it wasn't for radio operators. This sounds like they were recruiting for something else entirely. Something off the books." Then he mentioned Millwood, Maine. "I couldn't find any record of a base there ever," he said. "But I did find something else. A small private airfield was built there in the summer of 1946. It was funded by a shell corporation, a company that listed its address to a law firm in Washington, D.C. that also, incidentally, did work for the government." He took a deep breath. The airfield was operational for less than a year. It was abandoned by late 1947. The land was sold back to the state for pennies on the dollar. The pieces, dark and ominous, were beginning to form a picture she was terrified to see. A secretive government man, a hidden unit, a private airfield in the middle of nowhere. James hadn't been lost. He had been recruited, or taken. And the most chilling question of all began to form in her mind. If they took him to that airfield in Maine, what did they do with him there? And why did they never let him go? The mystery was no longer about a missing soldier. It was about what he had become and what had been done to him in the name of a country he had just finished fighting for. The truth was out there, in the lonely woods of Maine, and Eleanor knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she had to find it. The drive to Millwood, Maine, was a journey into a different America, a landscape of dense, endless pine forests and small, closed-off towns that seemed to exist outside of time. For Eleanor, every mile that clicked by on the odometer was a mile further into the heart of the mystery that had consumed her life. The professor's words echoed in her mind, something off the books. The rolling hills of her home state gave way to the flatter, more rugged terrain of the north, the sky a vast, oppressive gray sheet that promised rain. She felt small and incredibly alone in her little car, a tiny speck moving toward a truth she was no longer sure she wanted to find. Millwood was not so much a town as it was a wide spot in the road, a collection of weathered, clapboard buildings clinging to the edge of a vast, silent wilderness. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. The only sign of life was a flickering neon sign outside a diner that simply said eat. This was the place a train had been sent to, the final destination on a manifest for a soldier who was supposed to be coming home. It felt utterly wrong. There was nothing here. No history, no industry, no reason for the military to have any interest whatsoever. She parked her car and walked into the diner, the bell above the door jangling a loud, lonely announcement of her arrival. Every eye in the place, belonging to a handful of grizzled old men nursing coffee, turned to look at her. A stranger was clearly an event. She took a seat at the counter and ordered a coffee from a waitress with a tired but kind face. Quiet town, Eleanor ventured, her voice sounding too loud in the hushed room. The waitress, whose name tag read Flo, nodded. Quiet's the word for it. Always has been. You passing through. Eleanor took a breath. This was it. Actually, I'm looking for some information. About the old airfield. A profound silence fell over the diner. The men stopped talking. One of them slowly put his coffee cup down. Flo's friendly expression became guarded. Ain't nothing out there but weeds and old memories, honey, she said carefully. Not a place for sightseeing. Eleanor knew she had to be direct. She had come too far to turn back now. She opened her purse and took out the photograph of James, placing it on the counter. My fiancé was a soldier. He was supposed to come home in October of 1946, but he never did. I recently found out he was sent here. To Millwood. To that airfield. She tapped the edge of the photograph. The men were all watching her now, not with hostility, but with a deep, unsettling wariness. Flo picked up the photograph, her eyes softening as she looked at James's young, hopeful face. Oh, you poor dear, she whispered. She looked over at the oldest of the men, a fellow with a face like a wrinkled leather map and eyes that had seen too much. Henry, you remember anything about back then? The folks out at the field. The old man, Henry, shifted on his stool. He looked from Eleanor's desperate face to the photograph and back again. He sighed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. They weren't army, miss, he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. Not exactly. Kept to themselves. Had their own security. We were told not to ask questions. Paid good money for supplies, for fuel. But they were a nervous bunch. Jumpy. Like they were waiting for something bad to happen. Another man chimed in, younger than Henry, but still old. My pa used to deliver groceries out there once a week. Said it gave him the creeps. Said they had a radio tower that was always buzzing, day and night. And the planes that came in, they didn't have no markings. Nothing at all. Just plain silver. Eleanor's heart was hammering. This was it. The secret airfield. The ghost unit. What were they doing? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Henry shook his head. No one knew for sure. Lots of rumors. Some said it was a listening post for the Russians. Others said they were bringing in scientists, folks from over there, after the war, giving him new names. He looked at her with a pity that was worse than any anger. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that no one who went out there to work ever really left. Not the same way they came in, anyway. Flo leaned over the counter. There was an incident. Late 46. Right around the time you're talking about. We heard a loud noise from out that way. Not an explosion, but a pop, like a giant electrical short. Then, nothing for 2 days. And then, they were just gone. All of them, packed up and left in the middle of the night. Left everything. Just abandoned it. Henry nodded grimly. Went out there a week later. Place was empty. Looked like they'd left in a powerful hurry. Paper still on desks, coffee cups half full. He pointed a gnarled finger at Eleanor. If your young man was sent out there in October of 46, chances are he was there for that. The rain had started, a cold drizzle that matched the chill settling in Eleanor's soul. They gave her directions, and with a feeling of dread that was almost physical, she drove the 5 miles out of town down a crumbling, overgrown road that was barely more than a track. And then she saw it. The chain-link fence was rusted and fallen in places, consumed by thorny bushes. Beyond it, cracked tarmac was being reclaimed by grass and weeds. A single, dilapidated hangar stood with its door hanging off one hinge, like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. This was it, the place James had been brought to, the place he had vanished from. She walked through an opening in the fence, her feet crunching on gravel. The place was utterly silent, the only sound the patter of rain on the broken concrete and the sigh of the wind through 1,000 holes in the corrugated metal buildings. It felt not just abandoned, but wrong. It felt haunted. She pushed open the heavy hangar door, the screech of rusted metal tearing through the quiet. The interior was vast and dark, filled with the ghosts of forgotten machinery and the smell of decay. And then she saw it. Tucked away in a corner, half hidden under a moldy canvas tarpaulin, was an old, battered desk. Something made her walk toward it. She pulled the tarp away, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The desk was covered in faded papers, blueprints for things she couldn't understand, schematics of complex radio equipment. And there, stuck under a rusted metal ruler, was a small, water-stained notebook. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely open it. The pages were filled with dense, technical handwriting that wasn't James's. But on the inside back cover, someone had doodled idly. A sketch of a plane, a few mathematical equations, and then a name written over and over again, as if someone was practicing a signature, trying to make it their own. Michael Evans, Michael Evans, Michael Evans. And beside it, a single sentence, written in a different hand, a hand she would know anywhere. It was James's writing, neat, precise, and filled with a quiet desperation that reached across 40 years to clutch at her heart. The sentence read, "Tell Eleanor I try to come home." She sank to her knees on the cold, dirty floor. The notebook clutched her chest, the tears finally coming in great, heaving sobs that she had stored up for a lifetime. He had been here. He had thought of her. He had tried to come home. But what had they done to him? Why had he been given a new name? What was the incident that had made them flee? The mystery was not solved. It was deeper and more painful than ever. But she had found the one thing she had truly been searching for. Not a body, not a simple answer, but proof. Proof that he had loved her until the end. Proof that the young man she had waited for had never willingly left her. He had been caught in something he couldn't escape, a hidden war that continued after the peace was declared. She left Millwood as the sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows through the pine trees. She didn't have the answers. She likely never would. The truth about Unit 7, about Jay Walters, about what happened at that airfield, was buried too deep, lost to time in official secrecy. But she had the last message he would ever send. "Tell Eleanor I try to come home." She drove back through the gathering darkness, not toward the resolution she had imagined, but toward a new kind of peace. A difficult, complicated peace built not on answers, but on the certainty of his love and the tragic truth of his fate. The world would always remember James Miller as the soldier who vanished without a trace. But Eleanor would now remember him as the man who, against all odds, from the heart of a terrifying secret, had kept his promise. He had found a way to come home to her, and after 40 years, she had finally been there to receive him. The mystery remained, but the love, at last, had been found.